Hello, everyone, and welcome back from your break. I would like to welcome everyone to the Land Acknowledgement Workshop. In this workshop, we will hear a presentation on the elements of respectful land acknowledgement so that participants can create appropriate and respectful acknowledgements for their organizations. We will open discussions up to a question and answer session after the workshop, so please add your questions directly to the Q&A box so that they can be addressed at that time. Our workshop hosts can now begin this session.
Thank you, Anne. So let's just jump in. Luhui, do you want to just share the slides? Okay. So today we're going to talk to you about crafting a land acknowledgement, and we have two hosts of this workshop. And this will be pretty interactive, especially as we get through the end or through to the end of the workshop. So just get ready to click some links and think about some things. So first, we want to acknowledge again, as we've already talked about this morning, that we are on Kalapuyan land here at Oregon State University. And it's important to know whose land you're on. Next slide. Thank you. So just a quick overview about what we're going to be discussing today in this workshop. We're going to give you some quick information about our workshop speakers, and then I'll go into a historic overview of native lands. And the one thing to note about this is that we're talking specifically about the United States in this program, and there's a long history of differences between what has happened to Indigenous peoples all over the world. So we're situating our focus more on the United States. But land acknowledgement should be done globally. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what a land acknowledgement is, why they're necessary, what the critiques are about land acknowledgements and why we need to be listening to those critiques, and then what necessary elements you should include if you or your organization or institution are ready to start creating or revising your land acknowledgements. We're also going to be talking about the need to move from performance to action. So we want to get out of the performative land acknowledgements and move these into action-oriented directions. We're going to talk about that today. We're going to give you a lot of great tips so that you can be ready to actually make a meaningful action-oriented land acknowledgement for your institution.
Lara, I need to stop share and reshare because I forgot to optimize. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Gives me a chance to get a sip of my tea. Okay, well, I can barely see the slide now.
Okay, let me try that again. Sorry.
It's okay.
Thanks for your patience, everyone.
We'll be working through a few little things like this all day, so bear with us. Okay, so our workshop speakers, my name is Lara Jacobs. I'm a citizen of Muskogee Creek Nation. I'm also a PhD student at Oregon State University. I'm studying in a field called recreation ecology. And I'm actually joining you from Alsea lands. I'm actually out on the Oregon coast, but I attend school at Oregon State, which is on Kalapuyan lands. Luhui, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, haku everyone. My name is Luhui Whitebear. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a member of the coastal band of the Chumash Nation, and I'm a little ways away from my homelands, and I also have Huastec and Cochimi ancestry. I'm an assistant professor for the School of Language, Culture, and Society here at Oregon State University, and I'm also serving as the center director of the Kaguik Mana Ina House, which is our Indigenous-based center on the Corvallis campus. And I live and work on Kalapuyan lands. I've actually, besides my own tribal homelands, lived most of my life on between my stepfather's lands, the Siletz people, and Grand Ronde lands as well.
Thank you. Okay, so let's do a very quick overview of Native history. Before the United States was ever established, these were native lands. Everything that you see on these maps, these were indigenous lands. and they were stewarded by Indigenous peoples for tens of thousands of years. And once European settlers came over and the United States started to be colonized, or the areas started to become colonized as the United States started to grow its capacity and form its government, we can trace this back to a history that was founded on settler colonialism that includes the land occupancy of settlers of Indigenous people's lands. So there's a big history of land occupancy in this country. We also see a state that is founded on white supremacy, and lots of policies and lots of historical incidences where we have, these long histories of slavery of Black and Indigenous peoples. There's really strong histories of Indigenous land theft from, treaties that were forced onto Indigenous peoples to Indigenous peoples who were forced to cede their lands, and in other circumstances where the United States just occupied them. We also have a history where US policies have led to the largest genocide in global history. Next slide. So when I talk about genocide, I never use that word lightly because, genocide is intended to exterminate a group of people. And a lot of people feel very, very uncomfortable when we talk about genocide, especially when we talk about the history of the United States, which was built upon the genocide of Indigenous peoples. And, there's learning that can happen in that feeling of uncomfortableness. So if you feel that when I'm talking through this slide here, just take a breath and give yourself a moment to learn. Before Columbus arrived, and we all, I think hopefully at this point we know that Columbus didn't actually come to the United States, but before he arrived in North America in 1492, scientists estimate that there were about 60 million Indigenous peoples. And about a century later, due to violence, due to wars, due to disease, about 90% of Indigenous peoples are estimated to have been killed. So when we talk about genocide, we're talking about the death of nearly 55 million Indigenous peoples. The population is estimated to have dropped from 60 million to 6 million people in 100 years. So yes, this is a genocide, and the impacts of this are still ongoing to our people today. Next slide. So what happened through colonization? Our land started to become occupied, and we were forced to sign treaties. Our lands were dispossessed. We had to cede our lands. The United States started to occupy them, especially in cases like Hawaii, where, they just literally are still there occupying Indigenous Hawaiian people's lands. Today, this is a data set from the BIA right here. This is not my data set, but this is their data set that I converted into a map. Today, tribes hold the rights to 326 land areas. And if you remember that first map that I showed you where everything was gold and everything was Indigenous lands, this is the point that we're at in time today, where tribes have the rights to these small land areas. It's only 326 land areas. I should say that the United States also holds the titles to these lands in trust. For those of you who are from Indian country, Oklahoma, where my people are from, you're probably wondering, why isn't Oklahoma on the map? Where are all the reservations there? That's because most of those lands there are they're in fee status, and these maps here are about trust status lands. So these are the areas that tribes hold rights to today. But like I said, the United States still holds the titles to these lands. But even with the titles, these are still Indigenous lands. Next slide, Luhui. So what is a land acknowledgement? Land acknowledgement affirms the existence of the original land stewards. And historically, Indigenous communities have been using these for a long time to reinforce our histories and our genealogies and our practices and our relationships with local ecosystems and with everything that our ecosystems contain. Today, we're seeing these used more and more by non-Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples are still using them as well. but we're seeing them used by others who are non-Indigenous to recognize the Indigenous peoples who first lived in specific areas. And generally, they're a sign of respect. Next slide. So why are they necessary? Like I said, they're a sign of respect to Indigenous communities, especially the people whose land you are occupying. Think about right now, do you know whose land you're on? Do you know whose land you work on? Do you know whose land you live on? Do you know whose lands you travel to for vacation? Those are things you should know and carry with you throughout your day, especially so that you can show that you respect Indigenous communities by learning about the histories of what happened to them. So land acknowledgements are statements. They help us show respect to Indigenous communities. And when they are done in a non-performative manner, they help us build better relationships with local tribal nations and other local Indigenous peoples. They also help us establish commitments to local tribal nations when they're non-performative. We will continuously highlight the fact that we're talking about non-performative versions of land acknowledgements here. So they help us to establish commitments to local tribal nations and other Indigenous peoples served by different institutions, organizations, universities, things like that. They also serve as a self-accountability measure for the institution and for the people who are saying these statements that they can use in their decision-making practices. Next slide. So throughout this workshop today, we're going to have several moments where we ask you to reflect, and this is the first one. So the first question that I'd like to ask to all of our audience members is, where have you heard a land acknowledgement? Think about the places, think about the people, think about the institutions or the organizations. If you have never heard one before, think about the one that you just heard, an hour ago when the traditional Ecological Knowledge Club provided our land acknowledgement for the summit. What message have these land acknowledgements that you've previously heard conveyed? What do you think they were intending for you to learn? What purpose did they serve? If you are writing down notes, these are 3 really good things to carry forward with you during the rest of the presentation. So kind of hold on to these thoughts as we move forward. Okay, Luhui, next slide. Where should land acknowledgements take place? They should take place anywhere, even on digital platforms. Just like the slide shows, no matter the platform, it's still native land. Digital space, like this webinar, is still native space. The server, the ground holding the cable tower, the air that holds the Wi-Fi signal, you are on Indigenous land. So anywhere where you are on Indigenous land, which is basically everywhere, is where a land acknowledgement should take place. Next slide. Who should facilitate a land acknowledgement? This is a question that I get asked a lot, and I know that a lot of Indigenous people have to deal with. Don't ask an Indigenous person to do your land acknowledgement for you. Land acknowledgements are things that should be facilitated by institutions and organizations and corporations and businesses and schools and everything in between. Any entity that occupies Indigenous lands should be facilitating a land acknowledgement, but it is not an Indigenous person's responsibility to do that labor for your institution. And if you have an Indigenous person who is part of your institution, it is not that person's job to be delivering that message either. Indigenous people, we know whose lands we're on. We know, we know that there are lands if we're on our own homelands. We know when we're guests in other people's homelands, but the facilitator should typically be non-Indigenous peoples. Next slide. So there's been a lot of critiques of land acknowledgements. I was very fortunate to work with a large group of Indigenous scholars who were from different fields. And we published a paper about a year ago about cultivating sovereignty in parks and protected areas. And we focused a lot on land acknowledgements. And this was kind of a critical thought piece. And we outlined the two archetypes of land acknowledgements as we see them today as Indigenous peoples. And the first one is pretty good, where we see solidarity-based calls for recognition that people are facilitating through their land acknowledgements. And the second one is where we start seeing these critiques emerge, where Indigenous peoples feel like a land acknowledgement is just giving them empty platitudes that don't really dig into more generative, action-oriented outcomes. And this is when we start hearing, or start seeing lip service and just really weird things happening when we're listening to land acknowledgements. Next slide. So when we dig into the critiques, especially about that second archetype, most of the problems are when land acknowledgements often just situate Indigenous peoples and the peoples who they're speaking about as these historic figures, right? And they're talking about the historic harms that have happened to Indigenous peoples, but they never start engaging with the ongoing issues that are happening today. And colonization is not this one point in time. It is a structure that is still impacting the lives and realities of Indigenous peoples today. And so when we only talk about points in time when Indigenous people were removed, you're erasing a long history and even the present of Indigenous peoples. So that's a critique you need to think about when you are creating your own land acknowledgement and trying to make sure that you don't fall into that way of writing or speaking. Other critiques of land acknowledgements are that they often fail to mention Indigenous people's roles in maintaining biodiversity. We are about 5 or 6% of the global population, Indigenous peoples, and we maintain the most biodiversity collectively on Earth, even with our small populations. And we've done this for tens of thousands of years as land and water stewards. And this is kind of, an important thing to think about when you're writing your land acknowledgement is the roles that Indigenous peoples played to steward and oversee land and water management in your local area before colonization and even still today. Other critiques of land acknowledgements are that they often dehumanize and tokenize Indigenous peoples and just kind of refer to us as these relics from the past. And that's very harmful. That's something that no one wants to hear, especially since we are alive and living today. A good example of this is I read maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago, a land acknowledgement from my ancestral homelands down in the Southeast on a university's website. And all it did was basically talk about how our people were removed from the lands, and that was really it. And to read that as an Indigenous person, it's a very odd feeling because we're still here, we're thriving, we're resilient, and we're still doing amazing things today for our people and for the future generations of our people. But when you think of us only in historic terms, that's Indigenous erasure. So don't do a land acknowledgement that erases people. Other critiques of land acknowledgements are that they're not action oriented. So there's no steps, there's no follow through. This is when we start saying that there's no outcomes for Indigenous peoples. Like it doesn't do anyone any justice, or it doesn't benefit them in any real ways when you just say, hey, these are Indigenous people's lands, period. It's like, okay, that's great to hear, but what does that mean? What does that mean that your institution is going to do after you recognize those lands? So critiques of land acknowledgements often are because of the lip service and the empty words and platitudes that kind of go into how some of these are established. They also sometimes don't consider like I said, our people today or the future of our people. So these are the main critiques that we've seen so far from throughout the literature and just from listening to Indigenous peoples in general. Next slide. Okay, so you might be in a place where you're ready to craft a land acknowledgement, or potentially where you're ready to revise one. So the first thing you need to do is reflect. You need to do some self-reflection, and you need to think about why you are creating a land acknowledgement. Are you doing this because you want to inspire other people to take action, or are you doing this out of guilt? And if you are doing it out of guilt or like out of white fragility or anything like that, then you need to do more reflection, and you need to to figure out, why or whenever you are actually ready to move it into this way to inspire others to take action. So yes, it should be an action-oriented thing. It should not be something that you're doing because you feel guilty. You also need to reflect on your goal. What's your institutional goals? What is your personal goals? How will your words impact your listeners? And how will those words impact Indigenous peoples who are listening to those land acknowledgements? You also should consider the timing. So when will a land acknowledgement statement have the largest impact to your audience? So consider the timing. You also need to think about your language choices and your audience as well. Next slide. There's also work, lots and lots of labor that goes into crafting a land acknowledgement. So I posed this question earlier to everyone. I want you to think about this. Do you know whose land you're on right now? Do you know whose land you live on? Whose land do you work on? Think of the last vacation that you took. Whose lands were you on? How often do you think of those questions? I heard something the other day, and it was a question or kind of a statement that someone made that we often, Indigenous peoples sometimes wonder how often non-Indigenous peoples think about them, especially as they're occupying our lands. And you should be thinking about those things every day. Most Indigenous peoples think about non-Indigenous peoples every day because you're part of our realities. But our lands and our lives and our ecosystems are also part of your realities. And so you should be thinking about those things as well. So when you're doing research, you need to figure out whose land you're on. You need to figure out how Indigenous peoples tell their perspectives of histories and their histories of the lands. And you need to be open to the fact that more than one truth can exist at the same time. So, when you're thinking about Indigenous histories, you may have to completely set aside your K through 12 education or even things you've learned in higher education to understand that Indigenous peoples are going to have a very different side of history that they want for people to learn about their people. You also need to do research about their treaties and understand that, the treaties have situated a lot of the rights that Indigenous peoples have today. And there's a lot of Indigenous peoples who don't have treaties too. But these are ways that you can do research to fully or to more closely understand the Indigenous peoples that you're learning about. And you also need to think about the place names, Indigenous peoples' place names and the languages that they use to refer to different things in the environment, the original words that were spoken on these lands. I always kind of have this joke amongst many of my Indigenous friends, but English is also a foreign language on these lands, right? So think about the original languages that were here before English was ever on these lands and how you can use Indigenous place names correctly. You also need to make sure you pronounce tribal words correctly as well. That's very important. Next slide. So when you're crafting a land acknowledgement, there's a couple things you need to think about. You need to think about appropriate language. Lots of people feel very uncomfortable when they use words like genocide and stolen land and occupation and forced removals and settlers and colonizers. But these are appropriate words. They're very appropriate words to use to adequately describe the harmful history that Indigenous peoples have endured and currently are enduring because of settler colonialism. So if these words make you feel uneasy, if they make your organization feel uneasy, you might need to go back and do some reflection on what is the purpose of what you're trying to do. And are you ready to actually create a land acknowledgement that tells the truth of Indigenous peoples and our histories? You also need to think of tense, like what tense are you using? You need to consider past tense, present tense, and future tenses. So we have long histories and long roots with our homelands, but we're also still here today. Many of us are. And so you need to talk about us historically, currently, and also use tenses for our future, because land acknowledgements should always consider Indigenous peoples' futures as much as we consider our past and our present. So there's a few necessary elements that you need to think about when you're crafting a good land acknowledgement. The first one is that if you have the ability and you are ready to start relationship building with local tribes, try to get them involved in the process of your land acknowledgement statement, or have your institution be involved with local tribal nations. You can also have involvement from Indigenous peoples from your institution and organization. And if you don't have any Indigenous peoples who are working with you, that's another point of reflection where you might need to ask, why don't we? Why don't we have Indigenous peoples who are in our faculties, who are helping on the board of our companies or anything like that? And, that shows another way that you're invested in taking action too, by investing in Indigenous peoples through your workforce. You also need to make sure that you have accurate representations of history from Indigenous perspectives, and that, the key word is from Indigenous perspectives here, and that you're not basically whitewashing Indigenous history. So you also need to keep in mind that Indigenous realities are something that have to be maintained throughout your land acknowledgement. Our historical ones, our current realities, and our future hopes and aspirations for our people as well. One of the most powerful things you can do with a land acknowledgement that is a needed element is have action-oriented directions that help support Indigenous people's futures, so that the people who are listening to your land acknowledgement have some steps that they can take afterwards to take action. But you also need to have those actions being taken by the people or the institution or organization who is giving that land acknowledgement as well. So it's not just lip service. Next slide. If you are going to get tribal support, if you're going to reach out to tribes, make sure that you are ready to compensate them financially or in any other ways for their emotional and intellectual labors. This is not something that tribal people or Indigenous people should be doing for free. So that's a caveat. If you want tribal inclusion, you need to pay them for their efforts. Next slide. Okay, another reflection here. So after knowing these things about the language and the tense and what types of action-oriented things you should be having in your land acknowledgement, I want you to sit for a moment and think about how ready you are to craft or revise your land acknowledgements. Do you know how the one from your institution or your organization was created? Who was involved in those processes? Did you have any Indigenous peoples involved? Did you listen to Indigenous peoples tell you about their histories while you were creating those land acknowledgements? Or did you just go and do like a Google search and figure out something on your own? How were those created? What was the relationship process that was involved in learning about those histories or working with other peoples to create a land acknowledgement? What commitments are you ready to advocate for? What commitments can you actually do as an organization or an institution? And what will accountability look like for your institution or for you as a person? Next slide. Oh, okay, there you go.
Looks like it's my turn. And we're going to talk a little bit about allyship and building land acknowledgements and moving beyond the performance. And so we have some examples here on what performative land acknowledgements look like, and we can talk about how it feels a little bit too. So if it's said as a formality at the start of everything, like everything under the sun is just like this blanket statement, land acknowledgement, without any examples of going further than just saying those words, it just becomes part of a script and it feels very empty. I know I've been to many things, even on our own institution here, where I hear them and I'm like, okay, what is this program or what is this department? How are they working in relationship with the Indigenous communities here on campus, and even more with the tribal nations? And a lot of times I know for sure that they don't do anything. And so it feels like this performance and this like gesture to the past instead of talking about who's here now and what we need in the future, what changes we need to happen. it doesn't include local tribal nations in any capacity. So if you're making your own, or even if you're like trying to, oh, that one's later. So if you're not including any tribal nations in any capacity, like, did you look up a land acknowledgement that a tribal nation has already created? And if so, for the same area, like if somebody was looking for one specifically here in Corvallis, like the one that OSU is using has involvement. So do you need to replicate that ask again, or can you reach out and say like, hey, did you work with the local tribes in finding that out? So there's ways to include tribal nations without asking for additional labor as well. But if there's no involvement, or you have no idea and you're just like, I just wrote this because it sounds like I need to, that's a little bit performative as well. So if it strives to do more, for example, if it centers settler guilt and tries to say we're a nation of immigrant kind of approach, which is completely false anyways, and really centers the settler guilt, that's another piece that makes it a little bit less about what it's for and more about mending your own self-guilt. And if it centers other forms of oppression, so sometimes people will ask like why it doesn't include certain other pieces of history, like immigration rights or recognition of enslavement of Black community members. And it's always this reminder that those statements are very important and can be done in conjunction with land acknowledgements, but that's not the purpose of a land acknowledgement. Is literally a relationship building with the Indigenous people whose lands you're on. And you can do those together without it being all one and done, and everything needs to be in this one statement. And so those statements are also very important to acknowledge because they're very relevant and part of healing for our communities. But if it's decentering the practice itself, because the land acknowledgements, as Lara said earlier, are an Indigenous-based practice that have been going on since before colonization and have continued through colonization that we're still experiencing. So when we try to do too much with them to do more, we're kind of decentering the practice itself. And then also seeking to be a better land acknowledgement. I've seen that happen even here on campus and in other areas where people are like, I don't really like that one, I'm going to rewrite it. And you're like, okay, but we worked on this with tribal people and this is what was asked and this is what we are going to use. And you can like expand on it, but like centering the core piece of it, like rewriting it and saying like, I'm going to do one better, or this other organization is, I like theirs, but I'm going to redo mine so it sounds better. That's kind of a little bit performative too, because it makes it about being the best instead of having the best intentions, or centering the practice piece in, especially when there's ones that created that tribal nations were a part of and you think you're making it better, because that kind of decenters their ask. And it doesn't fulfill action beyond words. So it's just this performance of words without any action items. So if you have this land acknowledgement and don't do anything beyond that, it's like, why do you even say it? Like, are you not going to actually honor the words that are said in that acknowledgement? And some non-performative actions are recognizing that lands and Indigenous peoples are minor steps in the right direction. So doing this recognition of the lands, that's like step one. That is the bare minimum. That's not the end of the story. We need to be doing more. And recognizing that the settler state and the impacts of colonialism are ongoing. So colonization is not past tense, it's active. Like we coexist with a settler state as Indigenous people and tribal nations. It's not like this is over, where our lands are actively occupied and our waters and our resources are exploited very actively. And we live with this tension of coexisting with a settler state. And that recognition needs to happen as well. With that understanding of building those relationships. And you should be centering your politics around land back efforts. So land back literally means land back. It's also the access to the lands, and also it's also the access to our sacred sites and our medicines and our waters that are on our lands, but it is also literally about land back as well. And non-performative actions also include supporting Indigenous people's activism as land and water protectors and defenders. So if people are out there putting themselves on the line, both in direct action and also in places like in policy making and in government halls, that all counts as well. So how do you support that with your actions beyond the statement itself? And then of course, donating time, money, and efforts to Indigenous-led causes. So what are those causes? We'll talk a little bit more. You should find out what's relevant to the tribal nations whose lands you're on, as well as what are the issues impacting the local Indigenous communities, and also nationally, of course. So we're going to talk a little bit about OSU's land acknowledgement. Hopefully the link will open and it will show you instead of the slide. And this one is really intentional. I will say it's not perfect, and there is, of course, there's room for strengthening it. But I will say that it was grassroots and Indigenous led on campus, and then it was sort of like co-opted, for lack of better words, by other places on campus without the action piece. And we did partner with one of the local tribal nations for some of the accuracy to make sure that we were getting the treaties right and everything like that, because we did have an error in it. So that's why working with tribal nations is really important, because you don't want to misrepresent what's being presented. It's also a call to action, and it has its commitments. And I'll talk about how we use it as a accountability. Can you all see this, Lara?
Yes, and I just put the link in the chat for everyone too.
Thank you. So this one is, this one combines the land acknowledgement that's on our email signatures and expands it. Part of OSU's history is being a land grant, aka land grab university, is really recognizing that. And some of this work started with OSU's 150 celebration, where of course everybody was like, yay, we're celebrating 150 years of being a land grant institution. And me and a colleague who used to work here, Dr. Allison Davis White Eyes, and some other faculty were like, so that doesn't feel good. That feels like really colonial and harmful to Indigenous students, faculty, and staff to be celebrating land grant history in such a very celebratory way without any recognition of what that actually means to the local tribes in Oregon and what it means to the Indigenous communities beyond the tribal nations that understand those histories that are on campus. And so we started working with OSU on not just the land acknowledgement itself, but helping the Board of Trustees and other folk understand what land acknowledgements are and what they mean. And we also asked the past president, Ed Ray, to deliver a land acknowledgement for the first time at one of our commencements with a call to action, not just this is whose land we're on and they're part of the past, but also the recognition and commitments to the tribal nations moving forward, and working with them on that commencement speech, which later ended up evolving into some of that text is here in the land acknowledgement as well. It was really important for us that we're helping draft that part of his speech to make sure that we really center Grand Ronde and Siletz in that we want people to do more. We want people to be involved with the tribal nations with their public facing efforts, and also to understand the histories and their current connections. And so one of the asks was to include at least their web pages in the commencement program, which happened. And so that was the first time that happened. And then it evolved into this one with that recognition of the land grant history, the land theft, and also what happened after that, and recognizing that, yes, we are on Kalapuya lands, which is the territories of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. But there's also other tribes like the Klamath, Kuslo, or Umpqua, Siuslaw, and Coquille people that were impacted by OSU's land grant history. And then the last part that's added in here is the statement that OSU understands that represented our multiple sovereign tribes amongst students, faculty, staff, and alumni. And then the acceptance of the responsibility for understanding the continuing impact of that history on these communities. And the statement of Oregon State's commitment in the spirit of self-reflection, learning, reconciliation, and partnership to ensure that this institution of higher learning will be of enduring benefit, not only to the state of Oregon, but also to the people whose ancestral lands we are now located. So and then it has the down here for people to learn more. It has a hyperlink for all the 9 tribes too. But for us, this last piece is so important because that's our accountability measure. So I'm gonna take this down and talk a little bit about the accountability measure. So if OSU as an institution has made this statement and this commitment, how do we remind people that are making policy decisions and that are making decisions about whether or not we have Kalapuya land signs up on Kalapuya land and things like that? How do we remind them like, hey, OSU as an institution has made this commitment, or the people that run the institution, because it's not a living being, of course, but people in those positions have made this commitment, and we're here to say, like, we want you to be accountable to that. And if you're not, like, we want to know why you're not willing to back up your words through actions. And so that's one example of the intentionality behind the land acknowledgement here at Oregon State. It took a lot of work and like years to get it to where it's at right now. That fuller land acknowledgement was launched at the during Indigenous Peoples Day this last fall. And so that's a pretty new one. And we continue to bring in that language and ask for OSU to do more and to do better, because we have so much growth to do. And there's more coming for our institution. But even though there's all this intention behind it, it's still used as performance by many on the campuses, not just here on the Corrales campus, but the other ones as well. And so even with the best intent, we still have to continue to remind each other and our colleagues, hey, that felt really performative. And that's hard because people are trying to do the right thing, but say, like, what are the action pieces? So I got
excuse me for interrupting, but I want to respect everyone's time, and we have about 2 minutes left in this session before we change over. So I wanted to get to the question and answer.
Okay, can I breeze through these real quick?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're gonna have to skip this one, but what I will say about this tribal perspective, so sorry, David, but is that in this clip, it was part of our Kalapuyan land series. In this clip, he talks about not doing land acknowledgements because they have become performative, and why that's harmful and how it can cause tension if they're done in a way that's performative, not only to the tribal nations, but like on what's being said and presented. So the ask is to do the action piece on that one. And so just reflect on how this will inform your use of land acknowledgements going forward and what you learned. And can you put this in the chat too, Laura, since we don't have time to?
Yep, I just did.
Okay, and so the Native Lands app, please do this and go over what you can do. Or do you want me to show one real quick, Laura?
Yeah, just show them how to do it. And so we were going to make this interactive, but you can do this on your own as well. So Luhui's going to show you how to use this website if you've never done it before. It's a super great resource for figuring out some history. And
okay, and this is a good example of a good ally too. Like, this is a non-native person who made this map and continues to grow it and has a disclaimer that says, like, we need to do, this isn't complete and we recognize there's errors. And so if you look at, I typed in Corvallis, Oregon, and it tells you what tribes and bands, but it also has this drop down that me and Lara wanted to make sure you all knew about, and that it has information about treaties. And so if you click on those, oh, that took us to one way far away. I don't know why it took us over there. It's supposed to only pull up the ones that are here, but oh, it's pulling up all the treaties. Okay, that's what we're talking about like they could do a little bit more different stuff. Oh wait, here we go. We'll do sluts. And it takes you to their web pages too, or some information about them. And it tells you their related maps. And so there's a lot of information on this site. They spend a lot of time and effort and do take feedback from tribal nations on everything. So what we want you to do is to know whose land you're on, visit their websites, read their histories. Most tribes have their histories, how they want them presented in the on their own tribal web pages. So sometimes when people ask me like, can you do a thing on local tribal history? I was like, no, you can go to the tribe's webpage and they have the history they want you to know about already on there. And then you can reach out if you have more questions to that tribe. And then finding out local campaigns you can support, and you need to find out how you can support tribes and what their needs are. And so we have some different ways to support and thinking about land back, what that means. We talked about murdered and missing Indigenous people and families is a huge issue. These are all areas you can support through your land acknowledgement efforts, and also climate justice and food sovereignty, and of course everything that we already talked about. So basically these are the histories of these lands are Indigenous. They're still Indigenous today, and the future of these lands will always be Indigenous, past, present, and future always. And so that's that part. So thanks for your patience, you all.
Thank you so much for the presentation. We have a couple of questions here. One is, can the reference citations be used throughout the presentation be made available for use after this meeting so that we can take them back to our organizations?
That's a good question. So after the summit concludes, as long as speakers agree to have their sessions recorded and things like that and then published, then we will send out that information to everyone. So you can send them potentially a video of this land acknowledgement workshop. And we can also ask our speakers, including me and Luhui today, if people can send out their slides as well, so that it's going to be subjective all throughout, the whole summit. But today, I think, Dr. Whitebear, would you be okay with us sending out our slides afterwards?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so yeah, we can do that.
Okay, we have another question. One issue I find troubling is my university, which is located on land that was given to removed peoples, is the tendency to list peoples who were removed to our area rather than the original pre-Columbian inhabitants. What are your thoughts on this?
I would ask them to center the people who were removed and the people who were moved there, because that is a reality of what happened. There's like this removal and there's a double removal happening. And so I would suggest working with both of those groups and see what kind of, how you can reconcile those differences on that. But I think acknowledging both is super important.
Okay, thank you.
I also agree with that, by the way. And I also want to say that that question came from Dr. Ray Piroti, who is an amazing TEK scholar. If you don't know his work, go read it. It's great. And thank you, Ray, for being here today.
There is a question, if the presentations will be available to participants later.
It's subjective to the people who are presenting. So if they're okay with us publishing them, then yes. So this one will be.
We have another question. Thanks for discussing this topic. I live in Puget Sound area where some of the tribes are not recognized and also some of the lands are disputed by one or more tribes. How can we do a proper land acknowledgement that recognizes the history of the tribes, but that is also sensitive to the, at times, clashing perspectives of the different tribes in the area? Great question.
That is a tough one. And I think it's similar to that other question about like the removed and then the brought in. And so it's acknowledging those tensions too, that some areas have become like very multi-tribal but always remembering like who was originally in that area. I think the one that is used often in Portland, Oregon is a good example of that, since it's not only like a very intertribal urban space pre what we think of urban areas in that region because of the confluence of two major river systems, but there's also, it was a site for relocation during the Indian Relocation Act. So there's like hundreds of tribes represented in Portland now. But there's also that longer history of the original folk in that area, which was a very multi-tribal place too. And so I think like taking a look at some other areas that have kind of navigated that and worked with tribal nations as thinking of an approach, but not obviously doing exactly what they did because it's different people. So that's one way to approach it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would just kind of reinforce and echo what Dr. Whitebear just said. I think that it's important to always acknowledge the original stewards and acknowledge the history. And if the history includes that conflict, acknowledge that history and make sure that what you're saying is representative of what the tribes feel, though, and their own perspectives. And, you know, show them your land acknowledgement. Make sure that it's something that they would agree with before you use it.
And our final question, acknowledgement begins with dialogue with the people or peoples of the lands, waters, or winds addressed. How are land acknowledgements allowing dialogue to safely begin by supporting peace processes and or access to justice? For example, how does the company on the referenced website mitigate its destructive power by promoting peace, justice, or dialogue with Indigenous peoples it is labeling and mapping? How would an institution of learning support Indigenous people's agency in naming themselves or identifying their territory? What is the process for those acknowledging Indigenous people's territories that supports Indigenous people's ability to withdraw to a safe space away from such violent land acknowledgements? Interesting question.
Powerful. I mean, that's a powerful series of questions.
Yes.
I don't know if we have time to address that fully. It's like, I feel like that needs its own conversation. Yeah.
One thing that I'll say on this is that I think that the beginning of this question, where we're asking, you know, how do companies mitigate their destructive powers by promoting peace, justice, and dialogue? That's where the self-accountability comes into the non-performative places of how land acknowledgement should be written and facilitated. And if it's performative, you know, then people are just going to have that statement and they're not going to be doing any type of action-oriented processes that help to create pieces, that help to invest in Indigenous futures. And we see that a lot, unfortunately. And how do they allow dialogue to safely begin by supporting peace processes? That's where you have to encourage other people to work collectively and collaboratively in good relations with their local Indigenous peoples so that you can have people joining their movements and lifting up Indigenous voices and lifting up our futures in the whole process. So land acknowledgements are a way for you to form those relations and to join our movements and invest in our futures. And if you're not using them like that, then go back and reflect.
There are a number of other questions that have popped up, and it looks like we have time for maybe one more.
Can I answer the one about the tuition?
I was going to suggest that, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. It says, shouldn't OSU provide compensation to Indigenous people for use of land that was taken from them? Free tuition for Native Americans would be appropriate. I'm glad you asked that because I totally missed that in when I was talking earlier. Part of why Oregon has now, which starting in the fall, the Oregon Tribal Student Grant that will help pay for costs of attendance after scholarships, is because of pushing for that through our land acknowledgements, specifically as a land grant institution, and the ask of tribal representatives from the local tribes asking for that. And so for them to be able to network with the other universities, it's now a statewide thing starting this fall for tuition for citizens of the Oregon tribes as a start. And we're asking for more here at OSU, and I know other institutions are as well in the state, but this is a huge step in what you're talking about. And I don't think it would have happened as smoothly if we didn't have that land acknowledgement commitment as an accountability measure. So that's what we're talking about, of how to use it for accountability. We're like, you said you want to do this, like, how are we going to make this work, and how are we going to help students from the tribal nations whose lands we're on come to school here, and the other lands that OSU has impacted and beyond that as well. And so, and that was from the efforts of student organizing as well, and asked, it wasn't just all admin folks. I want to recognize that that was a heavy ask from both undergraduate and graduate students, as well as faculty and staff on campuses.
It's a good one. And there's one more question. There's a lot of questions. I've tried to answer and filter through these and answer some of them in the chat, but there's another question that's a pretty good question down at the bottom. And it says, should peoples who have been removed acknowledge the original inhabitants of land that they were also removed, so they could be moved there? So I am a guest on Kalapuya lands, and I acknowledge that. I'm very grateful to be on these lands, to study and to work today. And yes, even me as a Native woman, I have a responsibility to acknowledge whose lands I'm occupying. These are not my lands, and these are not my ancestors' lands, but these are peoples whose lands were taken from them, and they deserve that acknowledgement from anyone. Yep.
And not only that, Laura, but like the responsibility to know the histories, right?
Exactly.
To know what's going on with the tribes now, like what's going on with Grand Ronde and Siletz, like how can we help uplift those causes through our positions and where we're at. So it's like the acknowledgement, and we also have a responsibility, and like Indigenous people get that. And I really hope that most people can understand that too. Like, you have a responsibility to understand the histories and the futures and the present.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
All right. Well, I think that's probably as much time as we have available right now. I would like to thank you both for your presentation. It was a wonderful, great workshop. Thank you.
Thank you.